January 17th, 1940. Northern France. 3:47 hours. The radio station hummed in the pre-dawn darkness, a converted farmhouse basement where frost crept along stone walls like skeletal fingers. In the corner, illuminated only by the amber glow of vacuum tubes and the occasional spark from worn electrical connections, 16-year-old Marcel Beaumont sat hunched over a transmitter that predated the Great War. His breath formed small clouds in the frozen air. Outside, winter gripped the Ardennes forest in silence, the kind of silence that precedes catastrophe. The boy's eyelids grew heavy. His head nodded forward once, twice, then settled against his folded arms on the wooden desk. The earphones slipped from his head. In that moment of surrender to exhaustion, in that single lapse of duty that would later be called providence, Marcel Beaumont fell asleep at his post. By all military regulations, by every standard of wartime discipline, this was a failure, a dereliction, the kind of mistake that cost lives, that broke defensive lines, that allowed enemies to slip through the cracks in civilization's fragile armor. Yet on this particular morning, in this particular place, the sleeping boy would become something else entirely, an accidental sentinel whose unconscious ears would catch what wakeful vigilance might have missed. The story of Marcel Beaumont is not the story we tell ourselves about heroes. It contains no calculated bravery, no moment of conscious choice between honor and survival. Instead, it is a story about exhaustion and chance, about the terrible weight we place on children during war, and about how survival sometimes hinges not on perfect execution, but on the human body's stubborn refusal to meet impossible demands. The winter of 1939 to 1940 exists in historical memory as the Phony War. That strange interlude when declarations have been made, borders have been fortified, and armies had assembled, yet no great battles erupted across Western Europe. The French called it Drôle de guerre, the strange war. The Germans called it Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. For 8 months, the great powers circled each other like cautious predators, building defenses, training troops, and waiting for the spring thaw that would inevitably bring movement, decision, and blood. But this apparent calm masked desperate preparations. Along the northeastern frontier of France, a patchwork network of observation posts, listening stations, and communications relays stretched across hundreds of miles. These positions represented the nervous system of French defense, the early warning apparatus that would, in theory, give commanders precious hours to respond to German movements. Marcel Beaumont had not chosen this role through any particular aptitude or patriotic fervor. He had been conscripted into it through circumstance and necessity. Born in Sedan in 1923, he was the youngest son of a postal worker who had died of influenza in 1936. His mother worked as a seamstress. His 2 older brothers had already been mobilized into frontline units by October 1939. When the Army's Communications Corps came recruiting for auxiliary operators, positions that required basic literacy, steady hands, and the ability to work long hours in isolation, Marcel's mother had volunteered him, believing that a posting to a radio station would keep her youngest son away from the trenches. She had not understood that modern warfare had abolished the distinction between front and rear, that the new war would target not just soldiers, but the invisible networks that allowed soldiers to function as coordinated forces. The farmhouse station where Marcel worked sat approximately 12 kilometers southwest of the Belgian border, positioned to monitor wireless traffic and relay messages between forward observation posts and divisional headquarters near Charleville-Mézières. 3 other operators rotated shifts in the basement, 2 career Army signalmen in their 30s and 1 conscripted telegraph operator in his mid-20s. Marcel, by far the youngest, had been assigned the graveyard shift, midnight to 8 in the morning, 6 nights per week. The work was monotonous. Hours would pass with nothing but static and scheduled check-ins, brief coded exchanges confirming that various units remained in position, that supplies had been received, that everything continued as it had the day before. The real challenge was not the technical complexity, but the grinding endurance required to maintain focus during those long dark hours when the body screamed for sleep and the mind drifted toward dreams. In training, Marcel had been taught to recognize different transmission patterns, the rhythmic dots and dashes of Morse code, the characteristic sounds of friendly versus potentially hostile wireless activity, the subtle variations in signal strength that indicated distance and direction. He had learned procedures for authentication, for emergency protocols, for maintaining equipment in freezing conditions. What they had not taught him, what perhaps cannot be taught, was how to sustain alertness through the fourth consecutive hour of silence, through the sixth night in a row, through the numbing repetition that made every night indistinguishable from the last. By mid-January 1940, Marcel had been on duty for 3 months. He had mastered the technical aspects of his work. He had also discovered that his body possessed limits that willpower alone could not overcome. The night of January 16th had followed the familiar pattern. Marcel had arrived at the farmhouse at 23:45 hours, relieving the evening operator. He had checked the equipment, logged the weather conditions, clear, -8 degrees Celsius, light wind from the northeast, and settled into the routine of monitoring. The scheduled check-ins had come at their appointed hours: 0:30 from the forward observation post near Bulge, 1:15 from the mobile unit stationed near Kerrigan, 2 o'clock from headquarters confirming receipt of daily reports. Between these brief exchanges, there was only the hiss of static and the occasional crackle of atmospheric interference. Marcel had tried the usual methods to stay alert, standing periodically to do calisthenics, splashing freezing water on his face from the bucket in the corner, reciting poetry his mother had taught him. But exhaustion is not a foe that can be defeated through tactics. It is a tide that rises regardless of resistance. Around 3:30, Marcel's vision had begun to blur. The amber light of the vacuum tubes seemed to pulse hypnotically. His head felt impossibly heavy, as if his skull had been filled with wet sand. He had stood again, paced the small room, performed 20 jumping jacks that sent aching cold deep into his joints. He had returned to his chair, placed the earphones carefully over his ears, positioned his logbook and pencil within easy reach. He had told himself he would just close his eyes for a moment, just a brief rest while his ears continued to listen. This was the lie that exhausted soldiers have told themselves throughout history. The belief that one can separate vigilance from consciousness, that the body can maintain its post while the mind escapes for just a few precious seconds of relief. Marcel fell asleep sometime between 3:35 and 3:45 hours. The exact moment cannot be determined from historical records. What we know is that by 3:47, when the first anomalous transmission reached the farmhouse receiver, Marcel Beaumont was deeply unconscious, his head resting on his forearms, his breathing slow and regular, his young body finally claiming the rest it had been denied. The earphones had slipped off during his descent into sleep, coming to rest on the desktop beside his head. This detail, this small mechanical displacement, would prove to be the hinge upon which 500 lives would turn. The transmission that arrived at 3:47 hours was not part of any scheduled communication. It came on a frequency that the French monitoring network had flagged as belonging to German military wireless traffic, low-priority supply coordination, not the high-level command channels that cryptographers focused on, but routine logistical chatter between transport units. The signal was relatively strong, suggesting the transmitter was within 50 kilometers. Under normal circumstances, an alert operator wearing earphones would have immediately logged this activity, attempted to determine its content through direction-finding equipment, and reported it through proper channels. A trained ear might have noted the transmission's content, coded references to road conditions, convoy timings, movement corridors, and flagged it as worthy of further analysis. But Marcel was not wearing his earphones. The transmission entered the receiver, was converted to electrical impulses, and had nowhere to go except the small speaker that the operators used for equipment testing. That speaker, rated at perhaps 2 watts of output power, began to emit the characteristic sounds of Morse code transmission, not loud enough to wake someone in deep sleep, but present, persistent, a mechanical voice speaking in the darkness of the basement. Dit-dit-dit-dit, dot-dit-dit. The transmission continued for approximately 4 minutes, a routine logistics report that in itself revealed nothing of immediate tactical value. Then it ceased. Silence returned. The speaker remained active, continuing to monitor the frequency. At 3:53, another transmission began, then another at 3:58. By 4:15, the frequency that had been silent for weeks was suddenly alive with German wireless traffic. Not the sparse, isolated messages of normal border activity, but a sustained pattern of communication that suggested coordinated movement on a significant scale. Marcel slept through the first dozen transmissions. What finally penetrated his exhausted unconsciousness was not any single message, but the accumulated volume. The fact that the small speaker was now emitting an almost continuous stream of Morse code, a chattering mechanical symphony where there should have been only silence. Sometime around 4:20, Marcel's sleeping mind registered something wrong. He surfaced from sleep, not suddenly but gradually, the way one rises from deep water, first becoming aware of distant sounds, then slowly recognizing that these sounds carried meaning, then finally, in a rush of adrenaline-spiked panic, remembering where he was and what he was supposed to be doing. He jerked upright, fumbled for the earphones, pressed them against his ears with shaking hands. The transmission was still ongoing. His sleep-fogged mind struggled to parse the rapid-fire Morse, to transform acoustic patterns back into letters and words. He grabbed his pencil, began transcribing with the mechanical precision that training had drilled into his reflexes. KWLONNE, ZWEI, column 2. His heart hammered against his ribs. How long had he been asleep? How many transmissions had he missed? He glanced at the clock on the wall, 4:23. His log showed the last entry at 2 o'clock. More than 2 hours lost. 2 hours when anything could have happened. The transmission ended. Marcel's hand was cramping around the pencil. He had partial transcriptions of 3 separate messages, none of them complete enough for full decryption, but all of them containing references to movement, timing, positions. He reached for the telephone that connected the farmhouse to divisional headquarters, then hesitated. What exactly was he reporting? That he had fallen asleep at his post and awakened to find wireless activity? That would be the end of his service, possibly a court-martial for dereliction of duty during wartime. But if he said nothing and this activity was significant, Marcel made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He picked up the telephone and asked to be connected to the night duty officer at headquarters. When the connection was made, it took 3 minutes to route through the military switchboard. He delivered his report with the careful precision he had been taught. Station 7 reporting. Monitoring German military frequency 428 kilocycles. Beginning at approximately 03:45 hours, sustained increase in wireless traffic. Multiple transmissions indicating convoy movement and coordinate references. Request guidance. He did not mention his sleep. He did not mention the missed time. He reported only what he had observed after waking. The duty officer, a Captain Rousseau who had worked in signals intelligence during the previous war, asked several pointed questions. How many transmissions? What was the signal strength? Could Marcel provide direction estimates? Marcel answered as best he could, his mind racing to reconstruct details from the fragmentary transcriptions on his notepad. Captain Rousseau told him to continue monitoring and to telephone immediately if the pattern changed. The call ended. Marcel sat back in his chair, hands still trembling, and forced himself to focus on the receiver. The wireless traffic continued. Over the next 2 hours, until the dawn shift operator arrived at 6 o'clock, Marcel logged 17 separate transmissions on the German frequency. Most were brief, status updates, coordinate confirmations, the routine communications of military units in motion. But their volume and timing suggested something that the intelligence staff at headquarters would later confirm. A major German convoy was moving through the Ardennes region on the Belgian side of the border, using the cover of darkness and the assumed safety of the phony war's static positions to reposition forces. The transmissions Marcel had intercepted were part of a larger German operation to move mechanized units southward through the forest roads that French military doctrine considered impassable for large-scale armor movements. When a morning operator arrived, a 34-year-old former railway signalman named Paul Tessier, Marcel handed over his log and his transcription notes. He mentioned the unusual German wireless activity, but said nothing about falling asleep. Tessier glanced at the notes, made a non-committal sound, and suggested Marcel get some rest. Marcel walked out of the farmhouse into the January dawn. The sky was lightening toward gray. His breath steamed in the frozen air. He had been awake for more than 22 hours. Every step toward the village where he lodged in a requisitioned room above a bakery felt like wading through deep water. He climbed the narrow stairs, fell onto his cot without removing his coat, and slept the dreamless sleep of complete exhaustion. He could not have known that his report had triggered a cascade of responses through French military intelligence. Captain Rousseau, though initially skeptical, wireless intercepts of logistics traffic were common and often misleading, had forwarded Marcel's information to the signals intelligence section. There, analysts who had been tracking patterns in German communications immediately recognized something significant. The frequency Marcel had been monitoring was known to be associated with transport units of the 19th Panzer Corps, a formation that intelligence had last placed near Koblenz, more than 150 kilometers northeast. If those units were now transmitting from locations that direction finding equipment placed in the Belgian Ardennes, it suggested a substantial redeployment that had occurred under cover of the phony war's lull. By midday on January 17th, French reconnaissance aircraft were in the air over the Ardennes. What they reported confirmed the wireless intercepts. Roads that had been empty days before now showed evidence of recent heavy vehicle traffic, churned snow, track marks, temporary supply depots. German forces were repositioning southward through terrain that French strategic planning had dismissed as unsuitable for mechanized warfare. This discovery prompted urgent consultations between French commanders and their British counterparts. What were the Germans preparing? Was this the prelude to a spring offensive? Were the traditional invasion routes through the Low Countries being reinforced or replaced by a thrust through the supposedly impassable forest? The information Marcel had provided, accidentally, through the strange providence of his exhausted sleep and awkward awakening, became one piece in a larger intelligence mosaic. Throughout late January and into February, French and British forces adjusted their defensive positions. Units were shifted to strengthen the Ardennes sector. Supply depots were moved. Evacuation plans for civilians in the border regions were updated and rehearsed. The village of Sedan, where Marcel had been born, was identified as a critical point in any potential German thrust through the forest. Its residents, including Marcel's mother, were informed that they might need to evacuate on short notice. Defensive preparations were accelerated along a 50-kilometer front. None of this activity was communicated back to Marcel. He continued his routine, 6 nights per week in the cold basement, monitoring frequencies, logging routine traffic, fighting the endless battle against exhaustion. He never mentioned to anyone that he had fallen asleep that night. The shame of it gnawed at him. He developed elaborate precautions to prevent any recurrence. He acquired a small alarm clock that he set to ring every 30 minutes. He began drinking bitter ersatz coffee before his shifts despite hating the taste. He wrote his mother's name on a slip of paper and kept it in his pocket to remind himself that his vigilance might protect her. The irony, that his failure had led to discovery, that his unconsciousness had permitted a warning that conscious attention might have missed, would not become clear for months. When the real war finally came, when the strange peace of winter shattered into violence, Marcel Beaumont was no longer at his post. The German offensive began on May 10, 1940, with simultaneous attacks through Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The main thrust came exactly where Marcel's intercepted transmissions had hinted it would, through the Ardennes, where General Guderian's panzer divisions exploited roads and terrain that French doctrine had declared unsuitable for armor. But the surprise was not complete. The defenses that had been strengthened in response to January's intelligence reports, including Marcel's accidental contribution, slowed the German advance at several critical points. Evacuation plans that had been prepared and rehearsed saved thousands of civilians from the path of the invasion. Marcel himself was evacuated southward with a headquarters unit as the front collapsed. His radio station, the converted farmhouse basement where he had spent so many frozen nights, was overrun by German forces on May 14th. The operators who had remained at their posts were captured. Marcel, traveling in a chaotic convoy of military vehicles and civilian refugees, made it to Lyon by early June. There, in the confusion of France's collapse, he was separated from his unit. He spent the summer of 1940 working odd jobs, trying to locate his mother, who had successfully evacuated Sedan and found temporary shelter with cousins in Brittany, and attempting to understand what had happened to his country. The full story of his contribution would not be assembled until after the war. In 1947, a French military historian researching the intelligence failures and successes of the 1940 campaign obtained access to classified signals intelligence files. Among the hundreds of reports and intercepts, he found Captain Rousseau's memorandum dated January 17, 1940, citing alert monitoring by Station 7 operator as the source of intelligence that had prompted defensive adjustments in the Ardennes sector. Cross-referencing military records revealed the operator's identity: auxiliary signalman Marcel Beaumont, age 16. The historian, Commander Jean-Baptiste Mercier, tracked Marcel to a postal sorting facility in Marseille, where he was working as a supervisor. In interviews conducted in 1948, Marcel finally told the complete story: the exhaustion, the fallen earphones, the sleep, the panic of waking to transmissions that had been broadcasting to an empty room. He wept as he described it, convinced even 8 years later that he had committed an unforgivable failure. Mercier's research suggested otherwise. Analysis of the German transmissions and the French responses indicated that approximately 500 soldiers and civilians had been evacuated from positions that were later overrun in the first 48 hours of the invasion. These evacuations had occurred because of defensive adjustments that traced back, through a chain of intelligence assessments and command decisions, to the warning Marcel had accidentally provided. Had he been wearing his earphones as regulations required, Mercier argued, he likely would have logged the transmissions as routine logistics traffic, which is what they appear to be individually. It was only their volume and persistence, made audible through the speaker as Marcel slept, that had impressed him as significant enough to warrant an immediate telephone call to headquarters. This analysis, published in a limited circulation military journal in 1949, became the basis for Marcel's belated recognition. He received a commendation for exceptional vigilance under difficult conditions and a small pension supplement. The irony of being praised for vigilance while actually having been asleep was not lost on him. In later interviews, after he had retired from postal service in 1975, Marcel would say that he never understood whether he had done his duty or failed it. The earphones falling off his head, was that negligence or providence? His panic-driven decision to report activity he had not fully monitored, was that courage or cowardice disguised? He lived with the contradiction for the rest of his life. But perhaps the contradiction is the point. We construct narratives about heroism that require consciousness, intention, and sacrifice. We want our heroes to choose their heroism, to face a clear moment of decision and act according to principle. Marcel Beaumont's story offers something messier and, in its way, more true. The suggestion that survival and salvation sometimes emerge not from perfect execution, but from human limitation, from the body's insistence on rest, from accidents of placement and timing that no doctrine can anticipate. The 16-year-old boy who fell asleep in a frozen basement was failing by every standard his superiors had established. Yet in failing, he created conditions for a discovery that prepared defenses and saved lives. What does this teach us about the nature of duty? About the impossible demands we place on the young during wartime? About the role of chance in human affairs? Marcel never claimed to know. He maintained until his death in 1994 that he had simply been lucky. Lucky that his exhaustion manifested in a way that permitted warning rather than disaster. Lucky that Captain Rousseau had taken his incomplete report seriously. Lucky that he had not been court-martialed for sleeping at his post. But luck, as the saying goes, is what we call the intersection of preparation and opportunity. Marcel had been prepared through his training to recognize anomalous patterns. The opportunity was created by his body's rebellion against impossible demands. The recurring symbol in Marcel's own recounting of that night was always the earphones, those heavy, uncomfortable devices that linked him to the invisible world of electromagnetic communications. When they were on his head, he was functioning as the system intended, a component in a machine of military coordination, an extension of technology's reach into human awareness. When they slipped off, when they came to rest on the desktop beside his sleeping head, he ceased to be a functioning component. He became, instead, just a tired child, a 16-year-old postal worker's son who should never have been stationed alone in a frozen basement, listening for electronic whispers in the dark. And it was in that moment of ceased functioning, in that brief escape from his assigned role, that the audible speaker created conditions for perception that regulated attention might not have achieved. The earphones, then, become a symbol for the larger truth Marcel's story reveals, that the technologies and systems we create to enhance human capability also constrain and exhaust that capability. We wire our sentinels to receivers and expect them to maintain perfect vigilance indefinitely. We forget that human attention is not an infinite resource, that consciousness has rhythms and limits, that the body will eventually demand what the spirit tries to deny. Marcel's salvation, and the salvation of those whose lives were indirectly preserved by his warning, came not from transcending these limits, but from failing to transcend them. His humanity, with all its weakness and need, proved more valuable than the perfect mechanical vigilance his role required. In the decades after the war, Marcel rarely spoke publicly about his experience. He married in 1952, raised 3 children, worked conscientiously in postal administration until retirement. Those who knew him described a quiet man, careful and precise in his habits, someone who always arrived early for appointments and who could not tolerate inefficiency or wasted time. His daughter, interviewed for a documentary in 2003, mentioned that her father was an insomniac throughout her childhood, often pacing the house at night, checking doors and windows repeatedly. She understood only later, after reading the declassified reports about January 1940, that her father had never forgiven himself for falling asleep, that he had spent 50 years trying to compensate for a moment of exhausted surrender that had, paradoxically, saved lives rather than cost them. This suggests something about the psychological burden carried by those who become accidentally essential. Marcel could not reconcile his understanding of duty with his knowledge of failure. The fact that his failure had led to good outcomes did not relieve him of responsibility for having failed. The structure of military discipline and the logic of personal accountability left no room for accidents that turned out well. He had been asleep when he should have been awake. That this sleep had permitted a discovery did not change the fundamental fact of dereliction. So Marcel punished himself for decades, his insomnia a self-imposed sentence for a crime whose victims were never harmed. Yet the 500 lives, the civilians who evacuated before the invasion, the soldiers who were repositioned to defensible positions, the families who escaped the first terrible days of conquest, these lives persist as the alternative evidence. We cannot name most of them. The chain of causation between Marcel's report and specific survivals is too complex, too branching, too entangled with thousands of other decisions to trace precisely. But the historical record confirms that adjustments made in response to the January intelligence, adjustments that included Marcel's intercepted transmissions, resulted in measurably better outcomes along the Ardennes front when the German offensive began. Measurably better, in war's grim arithmetic, means fewer dead, fewer captured, fewer trapped in pockets that collapsed before help could arrive. These unnamed lives form the ultimate truth of Marcel's story. He never met them. They never knew his name. The connection between his exhausted sleep and their survival existed only in classified files and historians' retrospective analyses. Yet the connection was real. This is the strange mathematics of historical causation. A boy falls asleep, earphones slip off, transmissions become audible, a report is made, intelligence is assessed, orders are issued, units are moved, plans are adjusted, and months later, when a storm breaks, Certain people are standing in different places than they would have been, and those different places make the difference between life and death. What Marcel provided, in the end, was time. Not much time, just a few months' warning that German forces were exploring routes through terrain the French thought secure. But time, in the desperate geometry of military preparation, is the most valuable commodity. Time allows reconnaissance. Time allows reinforcement. Time allows evacuation plans to be prepared and rehearsed. The time Marcel's accidental discovery provided saved the 500 lives that military historians, working decades later with full access to German and French records, could confidently attribute to the intelligence chain his report initiated. 500 lives. Not dramatic in the context of a war that would kill millions. Not even particularly notable in the first weeks of the 1940 campaign, which would see thousands die daily as France collapsed. But each of those 500 contained the same infinity that Marcel himself contained, the same capacity for love and fear, the same network of relationships, the same unrepeatable accumulation of experience and memory. 500 people went on living because a tired boy fell asleep and woke to sounds he should never have heard because his earphones had slipped off. There is no monument to Marcel Beaumont. His name appears in no histories except specialized military intelligence studies. The farmhouse where he served was demolished in the 1970s during highway construction. The frequency he monitored is now used for commercial FM radio broadcasting. The entire technological infrastructure of his vigilance, vacuum tubes, Morse code, wire telephone networks, has been rendered obsolete by digital communications. Even the postal service where he spent his civilian career has diminished almost to insignificance, replaced by electronic messaging that would have seemed like pure magic to the 16-year-old who sat in frozen darkness listening to electromagnetic whispers. But the lives persist. The 500 who were saved had children, who had children, who have had children. The descendants now number in the thousands, spreading across Europe and beyond, a vast web of existence that traces back through dozens of contingent decisions to that moment in January 1940 when a boy fell asleep at his radio post. None of them know they owe their existence to this accident. None of them could reconstruct the chain of causation. Yet they exist, and their existence testifies to a truth that Marcel spent his life struggling to accept, that our failures, like our successes, have consequences we cannot predict or control, that doing our best in impossible circumstances sometimes means failing in ways that paradoxically serve larger purposes, and that the line between hero and failure is often drawn not by our intentions, but by accidents of circumstance that lie beyond anyone's power to orchestrate. On a shelf in Marcel's apartment at the time of his death was a small wooden box containing his service records, the 1949 commendation, and a single object he had kept for more than 50 years. One of the earphones from the farmhouse radio station, retrieved during a sentimental journey back to the site in 1963 before it was demolished. The earphone no longer functioned, its wiring was corroded, its diaphragm cracked. But he had kept it, this artifact of duty and failure, of exhaustion and providence. His daughter donated it to the Museum of Communications in Paris, where it sits in storage, a piece too minor and too obscure to warrant display, a symbol whose significance is understood by no one except those who know the story it represents. That story, in the end, is the story of all who serve at the edges of awareness, who maintain the invisible networks that allow societies to function, who work through the long, dark nights monitoring frequencies that will probably stay silent, but might just possibly carry a signal that matters. It is the story of the impossible demands war places on human physiology and psychology. It is the story of how systems designed for reliability must accommodate human frailty. And it is the story of how salvation sometimes arrives not through heroic transcendence, but through simple, humble failure, the body insisting on sleep, the earphones slipping off, the small speaker broadcasting to an unconscious audience until, finally, impossibly, the boy wakes up and hears what he was never supposed to hear. Marcel Beaumont died in Marseille on November 3rd, 1994, at the age of 71. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his wartime service in communications and his long career in postal administration. It said nothing about January 1940, nothing about the sleep or the earphones or the 500 lives. That story remained locked in obscure historical files and in the memories of the few researchers who had pieced it together. But the story exists nonetheless, waiting in archives and artifacts, a testament to the strange alchemy of chance and consequence, of exhaustion and providence, of failure that becomes, through no intention of the one who fails, a kind of inadvertent grace. The lesson, if there is one, is not that vigilance doesn't matter or that we can relax our standards and hope for lucky accidents. The lesson is that human beings are not machines, that the systems we build must account for human limitation, and that sometimes, not always, not reliably, but sometimes, our weaknesses create possibilities that our strengths cannot. Marcel's sleep should not have saved lives. By every rational analysis, it should have endangered them. That it did save them is a reminder that we operate in a universe of staggering complexity, where causes and effects branch in ways we cannot fully predict, where the chains of consequence escape our control and comprehension, and where the only honest response is a certain humility about what we think we know and a certain gratitude for outcomes we never earned. The boy who fell asleep at his radio post and woke to save 500 lives never understood what he had done or why it had worked. He carried shame for his failure and bewilderment at his recognition. He could never reconcile the two. Perhaps that irreconcilability is the truest testimony to the mystery at the heart of human affairs. The fact that we are asked to do our best while knowing that our best is never enough. That we fail constantly, and sometimes those failures serve purposes we cannot see, and that our only choice is to continue showing up, exhausted and imperfect, to our cold basements and dark watches, trusting that if we fall asleep, the universe might, just possibly, arrange for us to wake at the right moment. Having heard in our unconsciousness what our vigilance would have missed, this is the story that needs telling. Not the clean narrative of heroism, but the complicated truth of limitation, accident, and undeserved grace. Marcel Beaumont, 16 years old, fell asleep at his post. 500 people lived who might have died. These two facts stand side by side, refusing to resolve into comfortable meaning, insisting on their simultaneous truth, the failure and the salvation, the sleep and the waking, the earphones on the desk beside the sleeping boy's head, and the voices they could not carry speaking into darkness until, somehow, impossibly, they were heard.